You know how debate works. That's the motion on the board. We'll just be going back for different time intervals. Every time you hear a point that you really like, you can vote to support your team. And then if you see us randomly stand up and interject with like a weird hand motion, don't worry about it. Just it's part of the And we're debating that this House would eliminate income tax for 5 years for all post-secondary graduates. And yours, like these guys are governments, and we are opposition, opposing the motion. First the last minute of the thing.
Yes. First minute. Okay. Time starts.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today's side government is here to propose a motion where this House would eliminate all income tax for 5 years on post-secondary graduates. Now, before we get into our reasons as to why we need to have this debate today, and actually the core argumentation as to why side government believes this is an important motion to put in today, I'd like to start off with a bit of a personal story. I'm about to graduate after a 5-year program, and I'm absolutely terrified about everything that's about to come my way. And that obviously includes the drastic income tax I'm going to pay, but that also includes the fact that I'm going to need to relocate, all the money I'm going to have to spend on finding a place to live, on the fact that I'm going to have to adjust to a new neighborhood. There are so many changes that come after finishing a post-secondary degree. And it's our job as government to make sure that we can alleviate some of those concerns. And so let's take it out of my personal needs. I know there's a lot of graduates that I know that are also in that same situation. But this is a societal problem that we need to face. And that's for two main reasons as to why we need to have this debate today. The first is that there's no secret that student debt is a problem, and it's a massive inflated problem in Canada at that. Students in Canada graduate with an average of $30,000 of student debt and take more than 10 years to pay that off on average. Think about those students that are in more expensive programs, averaging $50,000, $60,000 of debt and taking over 10 years to pay those back. That's a crippling burden for them to bear. And what does that result in? It results in them spending less on big ticket purchases, results in them spending less on advancing their careers. There's lots of things that there's limits for those students. That's one problem as to why we need to have this debate today, because student debt is such a big problem. The second is that our economy is shifting towards the need to have post-secondary education. You need to have higher education to compete, because Canada wants to be that service-based economy. We want to compete on that global stage. And as a result, we are forcing our residents to go into post-secondary education, but we're crippling them at that because they face massive student debt and also really high income tax when they graduate. And for those reasons, we are proud to propose this motion today. So what we're going to be walking you through is side government's 3 S's as to why this debate, why we believe that on our side of the House, we are capable of this debate today. The first is student debt, second is a shifting workforce, and the third is a strengthened economy overall. So remember those 3 S's. Student debt, shifting workforce, and a strengthened economy. Now, my second and third speaker are going to be diving into exactly what is the big problem with student debt today, what is that world that we're facing today, and how we're actually facing a shifting workforce. And by putting this motion in place, we actually better set up our workforce to not only be more beneficial for the individual that's in that workforce, but also sets Canada as a whole better up to compete on the global stage.
Point of clarification. Does your model include anything about how you're funding the gap?
Yeah, we're about to get into our model, so if you just wait, we'll get to that. What we're actually going to be talking about in the third speech is how we can actually fund this and how it's economically feasible and strengthening our economy. So let's dive into that model with the side opposition seat. I can't wait. So how this actually works is what will be in place is for post-secondary graduates, for everyone graduating either university or college for the very first time. Within 5 years of that graduation, you would see no income tax on the first $150,000 of their salary. So what that means is if I'm making $100,000, I get no tax. If I make $160,000, only $10,000 of my salary is taxed. So everything after that $150,000 mark, that will be taxed at the same rate as the highest tax companies here in Canada. So this again is for the first time around, the first time undergraduate college diploma that you go in, and it's not restricted to any age limit. So if you're 40, 50 years old and think that in the service-based economy, the current skills that I have don't set me well up to compete, you can go back to school, get re-educated, get retrained, which we want to encourage as a government, and not face crippling student debt while you can more feasibly manage your student debt because you don't have to pay these massive amounts of income taxes. The other thing that we want to know, what's going to be really important with this motion to put in place, is it needs to involve heavy education on money management for these individuals, because we don't want the case where they're going 5 years making about $100,000 in income tax-free, and then on year 6, suddenly they only make $60,000. So there is going to be a lot of programs put in place around making sure that people are aware of the changes that are coming at year 6, so it's not a shock, and we don't see a massive drawback in how we are managing their money. So, Madam Speaker, like we framed to you today, there's 2 core reasons why we need to have this debate today. Student debt is a massive problem in Canada, and the second is that we want to encourage a shift to more of a service-based economy. And so Side Government is going to prove to you today that for those 3 key reasons, those 3 S's, remember them? Student debt, a shifting workforce, and a stronger economy overall, we can feasibly tackle this problem by eliminating income tax for 5 years after graduation on the first $150,000 of your income. Thank you very much. We're proud to have this debate today.
This one's 7 minutes. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Side Government. I'll be sure to let BCG know that their relocation bonus is a little bit too low for you. Let's get going on this topic here. I really appreciate the 3 S's. The 3S framework that came up there. What I want to take in this first minute of the speech is actually reframe the argument and actually reestablish why we're here. The biggest frustration that we had on side opposition is that Side Government actually does not know why we're having this debate whatsoever. This debate is happening right now in federal governments, not because of student debt, not because of, I think there was another reason they gave that was also wrong, but I'm forgetting it right now. The real reason we're actually having this debate is because savings and savings levels in Canada have been a huge issue. So right now, federal governments are looking at 55 and 65-year-olds and basically saying, here's the problem. They have not built up enough savings to support a retirement lifestyle. And that's a separate issue altogether, but as a result of that issue, what they're actually trying to do is encourage savings levels in youth. That is, make sure that the next set of millennials, who are maybe 25 to 30 years old, are encouraged to have increased savings. And the idea is if they were to somehow reduce the tax burden on them, they would save more. So now that we've probably explained to government why they're having a debate today, let's actually move on to why side opposition actually has a completely different argument altogether. We don't really need 3 S's. I remember the 3 S's were, I think, something about simplistic, silly, and something else. I don't actually remember, but I want to give you 2 main arguments as to why side opposition is here today. Only 2. Number 1 is that reducing income taxes is not actually going to help these younger millennials. It's going to harm them. The second reason is that we don't need a new mechanism if we want to encourage savings. The mechanisms to encourage savings already exist in the economy as it currently stands. We need to do a better job with the existing mechanisms. Those are 2 things. 1, this is only going to cause harm, and 2, we don't need a new mechanism. We already have the right mechanism. I'm going to focus on what this harm really is. The first harm is basically stemming from the fact that side government does not understand how a household balance sheet works and how the government's balance sheet works. So let me explain that for them. I'm sure you already know this, Madam Speaker, so this is for side government's economics 101 understanding. Basically, if you want to reduce personal income taxes, side government acts like you can just do that. Reducing personal income taxes means that if money comes out of one side of your ledger, it needs to come out of another side of your ledger. So in this case, if you actually want to reduce personal income taxes, you have to find a way to get it back, because this is not actually a small number they're talking about. We did some math on what the size could actually be. I'm not even going to give them the math yet, because I want to see if they can actually do the math themselves. This is a big number, actually. So if you want to take away the personal income taxes from your government's coffers, you got to find a way to balance your budget. So how could you balance the budget? Probably through corporate tax increases. And that makes total sense to me. Like, I don't really care if the goal is to save savings and corporations make a lot of money. Let's penalize the corporations a little bit. But actually, that's not what happens. When you raise corporate income taxes, what companies tend to do, not at this time, to sustain their profitability levels, how they do it is actually decreasing the wages they pay to people. So I want to make this very, very clear. What government just did was shift the burden away from people for a second onto corporations, and then shift it back from corporations onto people. all this is going to do is lead to a gross pay reduction of wages for people of that age group. And that's what's so ridiculous about this argument, is that side governments basically put forth a motion based on a very, true emotional story that the Prime Minister brought up. That's a very true story. But it doesn't matter if you just shift the money from one place and shift it back on them anyway. So their motion is really handling the problem. I'll take it.
Can you explain how being able to pay off your student debt faster doesn't allow you to save more in the long run?
Because you didn't pay off your student debt faster. So I'll explain one more time for you. You reduce your personal income taxes, which means that then you have to raise corporate taxes. No problem. After corporates raise their taxes, what they do is lower the wages they pay on to people. What you just created, side government, was a reduction in gross labor and gross wages on the people that you were trying to help in the first place. That is the problem here. So you've not balanced your budget whatsoever. It's actually a common problem with governments nowadays. They don't have to balance their budget, and that is this one. So that was sort of the first harm they've actually created. If the root goal today was to save people from paying down debt, if it was to help them with the egregious relocation costs that they have to incur, if that was actually the motivation, you basically just put forth a net neutral strategy that did not help them actually solve the problem that you wanted to help them with in the first place. So that's point one. What we'd like to basically say on side opposition is what we identified in the first speech is, one, government is not aware of why we're having the debate today in the first place. Huge problem. Number two, they're not actually aware of how budgeting balancing works, or balancing a budget works. Because a reduction in personal income taxes does nothing to help the root cause that they actually wanted to do today, and it's just going to lead to a reduction of gross labor and gross wages anyway. So with all that being true, I have to ask side government, what was the purpose of their motion? How many minutes do I have left? All right, cool. What we're basically going to do as side opposition is, as I said, we want to roadmap essentially two clear stories for you. There's a series of harms that you're actually causing here. And the first harm is the one that I just went through, which is this idea that you wanted to help these people who have all these egregious costs and put onto their own personal balance sheet, but you didn't, because all you did was reduce the gross labor that they had to deal with in the first place. That was point one. My second speaker is actually going to come up and talk a little bit more about the idea of how why we don't want to reduce personal income taxes from a lifestyle perspective, and how that actually creates a challenge for people who adopt certain types of lifestyle and habits that make it difficult for a young person to transition away when the tax actually comes back into their system. And then the third point that we have on side opposition today is that the actual mechanisms for promoting savings already exist today. I just don't think side government knows about it. They just don't understand that there's already a mechanism in place called an RRSP. And if the RRSP had different limits, different allowances, and was raised, as our second speaker come to talk about, you could actually get to the exact same outcome without penalizing penalizing these young workers altogether. Now, let me reframe the first speech for a second and actually roadmap for the last one of where we are. Our first speaker came up and basically brought up two reasons why she thought we were having the debate today. One was that she thought there was a lot of debt. That is actually an incorrect fact. As a percentage of total debt in Canada, student and education debt is a fraction, a sliver of the problem. But more importantly, she also brought up this idea of the need for post-secondary education, how we're trying to promote people to go to post-secondary education. That is a fair point. So her second reason is fair. But neither of those reasons are actually why we are having the debate. The question that we are having this debate for is how do we encourage people to save more? We on side opposition are going to show you how the existing mechanisms that are in place, the RRSP, is the best way to promote savings if we tweak it slightly. And our second speaker will come and propose that model. The only other constructive point that was brought up was her three S's, and I did write them down actually: student debt, shifting workforce, and strengthened economy. However, student debt was not the issue. You didn't shift the workforce. What you actually did was shift the burden of personal taxes to the corporation and shift it back onto the person. So good shifting. And then the strengthening of the economy. It doesn't actually strengthen the economy if you don't promote savings. And as they clearly are not understood, that was the real motivation for why we're here in the first place. So for all those reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
All right, a lot of interesting points brought up by side opposition. But before I tell you why everything side opposition said is wrong, I'd like to take a step back and really look at why we're having this debate. So side opposition thinks that it's perfectly okay for a student to have, $30,000 worth of debt and graduate and somehow still save for retirement. We on side government see the real problem is that there is a debt crisis, and side opposition seems to ignore that. They say that, well, for average Canadian, student debt is an issue. That may be true, but for students, student debt is very much an issue, especially for millennials, where student debt is the fastest growing debt for millennials. Take that in. Student debt is the fastest growing debt for millennials. So not only are millennials graduating debt-ridden and debt-crippled, they're graduating with more debt. And side opposition seems to ignore that. They think that, it's okay for average Canadians, 60-year-old people who need to save up for retirement. This is not going to really affect them that much. But what we're here to discuss is the implications of income tax on the students who just graduate. So we're not talking about the people who are saving for retirement. We're talking about people who just graduate, who need this tax break so that they can start their lives properly. But you seem to disagree.
How does reducing gross income help these students pay off?
We're not reducing gross income. We're just simply. So we're saying is we're proposing a mechanism so that the students who just graduate have more purchasing power, more purchasing confidence. So they'll spend more money and they'll create actually more revenue in the long term for the government. And that's a point that my third speaker will talk about, is the specific mechanisms of how our plan will be more effective than what side opposition is proposing. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about what side opposition came up and said. They came up and said, okay, student debt's not an issue for students. And we on site government just showed you that student debt is the fastest growing debt for students. It's very much an issue. And the fact that side opposition ignores that completely just shows how ignorant they are of the real troubles facing students today. And student debt is very much a real issue, as everyone here can probably agree. So to suggest that student debt doesn't make any sense, is not a huge issue, doesn't make any sense. My third speaker will talk about the specific mechanisms of how we're gonna address our implementation. So again, our first speaker came up and told you about how debt is wrecking this generation of students. She talked about her own struggles, how she has to pay for all these living expenses. She has to pay off her student debt, and how she's being crippled by income taxes. She has to, pay taxes at the same time that she's paying off debt, and it's going to take her way longer to pay off debt because she has to pay income taxes. And we've shown that income taxes generally get paid off in 10 years. 10 years, that's a decade. It's going to take you a decade to pay off all of your debt. That's going to cripple, people who are just graduating. People can't make big ticket purchases. They have a very low standard of living because they're crippled by debt. And our solution directly helps to alleviate that debt by allowing them to have more money to pay off the debt instead of giving the money to the government. That actually balances out in the long term, as my third speaker will come up and say. So today, I'm really going to focus on my constructive point. So again, the three S's. First S, student debt. Side opposition completely ignores student debt. They say, okay, on average Canadian student debt's not a huge issue, but for students, it very much is a huge issue. And that's something that side opposition has to address in their next speech, or else we don't buy their argument. The second S, shifting workforce, something that I'm going to talk about, how education is no longer something that is a privilege. It's a right. People have to be educated today because our society is moving away from a manufacturer-based society to a service-based society. And education is the fundamental right for someone to succeed in our changing economy. And finally, our third speaker will come up and talk about how this solution will strengthen the economy in the long term. Sure, it's going to cost money in the short term, but our third speaker will talk about how in the long term, this is actually better for the economy. So I'm going to dive right into my constructive point, which is how shifting workforces need this tax break in order, students need this tax break in order to succeed in the shifting economy. So I'm going to talk about, again, how student debt is affecting people, but I'm going to spin it in a more social light. So student debt is affecting students because now people are disincentivized to attend post-secondary education because of the crippling debt they'll have to carry for the next decade. So, for example, if I'm a graduating high school student, I'm thinking about pursuing university education, but all of a sudden, I take a look at the statistics. I have to, carry debt for 10 years after I graduate. Like, I have to pay off debt for 10 years after I graduate. I'm probably not going to go to university. I'm just going to find, a short-term job. I'm going to work in fast food or some sort of some sort of low education job, and I'm not going to focus on the long term. And that's something that we on site government would like to address: the shifting of manufacture and a low education-based economy to a more service and higher educated economy. So again, sure, if I'm a high school student and I find a short-term job, I can have a job in the short term. But what about the future? What about when mechanization takes over those low-paying service jobs? These people will be left jobless, they won't be able to contribute to society because they were disenfranchised to take a post-secondary education. And that's what we really like to address, is how we can future-proof our education system so that people are more incentivized to receive a post-secondary education. So people don't have to, be jobless, be homeless, and not have a higher standard of living. So again, our economy is moving more towards a service-based economy. 80+% of all jobs in this economy in Canada right now is service-based. And these jobs require a high level of education in order for someone to have that job. So just having a high school diploma is no longer good enough in our society. You need a university diploma in order to be successful in today's society. And that's something that side opposition hasn't really addressed, that education is no longer a privilege, it's a right. And it's necessary for people to have education to be successful in today's society. So again, what did I talk about today? I talked about how side opposition completely ignores the debt crisis for students, how they downplay the debt, the crippling decade-long debt that they have to pay off, how they simply say, okay, whatever, it's only 10 years, they can pay it off, and how they think that the issue is with savings. Yeah, sure, students aren't saving, but why aren't they saving? They aren't saving because they're paying off their debt, and that's what we're trying to say. We need to have this break so that people can pay off their student debt. And how does that help us socially? It encourages more people to pursue university educations, to be more educated, so they can be more successful, they can be more productive for our Canadian society, which is moving more towards a service-based and higher educated sort of industries. So again, to reiterate, our 3 S's. First S, student debt. Student debt is an issue. It is pushing people. People are being affected. And second S, shifting workforce. Our society can.
That's why we're reading the table.
He thought you were like.
I really like that point.
I think
Okay, so I'm going to start the speech by addressing the student debt, because apparently government's not going to listen to any of our points until we do that, despite the fact that we addressed in the first speech, addressed in the POI, third time's the charm though. So essentially they're saying we need to address the student debt, and we've said this won't help reduce the student debt because all we're doing here is reducing gross income. To that, side government had to say, no, we're not. So I'll explain again why we are. You can't simply take a source of revenue away from the government and leave it as is. That source of revenue then has to come from somewhere else. The logical thing for the government to do would be to shift that burden onto the corporations. The corporations also don't want this burden. The corporations will then shift this burden onto their employees, and this is how this harm goes full cycle. So you're shifting it from the students to the government, from the government to the corporations, and from the corporations back to the students. So at the end of the day, you're not reducing debt, you're reducing gross income, which means that they still cannot pay off their debt. So if you do truly believe that debt is the issue here, this isn't a solution to the problem. Secondly, you said that students are not going to go to university because of this debt. I'm going to go ahead and say that's a bit of an it's a little dramatic. I don't think anyone's going to choose to change their entire lifestyle, their entire career path because of $30,000 of debt. So I think that's a little dramatic, but that being said, Canada has the highest percentage of post-secondary grads in the entire world. So clearly this isn't an issue in Canada. Okay, so now I'm going to go into my own constructives. So our first speaker came up and said, explained the whole burden of where this harm falls. So one more time to reiterate, the burden is currently on the students, it'll shift to the government, we'll then shift it to the corporations, we'll shift it back to the students, which isn't remotely helping these students pay off their debt. Yes.
Can you say how
So if you can find the benefit elsewhere, at the end of the day, the government's sole purpose, their job is to balance this budget. I don't know of a government that would come up and say, yeah, take this $50 billion, by the way, if you're wondering what that number is, that would, if you stop taxing this income, that's $50 billion of revenue that the government's leaving. They're not just gonna be like, yeah, $50 billion, peanuts, it's nothing, right? So it's not realistic to say, what if the government doesn't shift the burden? Because at the end of the day, it's the government's their job to shift the burden. If they're not shifting the burden, then they're not doing their job. So going into my own constructive, So we believe that the current system that's in place as of right now will actually do a better job of addressing this issue. And that root of the issue truly being savings. Debt here is not the issue. The root of the issue here is savings. We have a savings issue in Canada. As of now, the system we have in place are RSPs. Now, if government doesn't know how RSPs work, is that you can contribute from your income to your RSP, and at the end of the year, you'll get a tax refund on that money that you contributed. This actually directly incentivizes saving, unlike the system that government's proposing, which will give them additional income, but doesn't actually encourage savings, which means that it's not solving the issue. So currently, there's a system in place that actually encourages savings. Is this system flawed? Yes. Can we fix it? Yes. So as of right now, there's a cap on RSPs, the amount you can contribute, as there should be. However, the true solution to this issue would be raising the allowance on the RSPs. Because the fact is, in Canada, despite there being a savings issue, 68% of income earning Canadians already contribute the maximum amount that they can to their RSPs. What that tells us is that Canadians want to save. We recognize this as an issue and we want to save our money. However, we just don't have the tools to do that, and we're incapable of doing that because the current system is flawed. That doesn't mean the current system should be thrown out. It means that this current system should be amended to fix these flaws. The other piece that was brought up was the education issue. They said that they'll have programs in place to train and to teach people about what life will be like when you do get hit with this income tax. That's great. I've actually heard about income taxes my whole life, but never having been income taxed, I still don't know what that's actually going to be like. The fact is, you can tell me about these things all you want, but until I actually experience it and have to factor that into my lifestyle and my choices, I'm not truly going to understand the impact of these income taxes. So what we're doing there, those 5 years are when we develop our lifestyle and truly develop our habits and how we're going to be spending and how we're going to handle our money. All we're doing is putting Canadians at a disadvantage because we're giving them this 5-year grace period where they now don't have the ability to learn how to actually handle themselves when it comes a time that we're putting an income tax on them. That means in 5 years' time, despite these education programs in place, they might actually be earning less than they were as a recent grad. Even if you know that's going to happen, it's going to be a shock to your lifestyle. Even if you know you're being laid off, if you get laid off, you still have to adjust your lifestyle. That doesn't change anything. Being aware of the issue doesn't mean that you're properly suited and properly equipped to handle it. Simply taking this, giving them this 5-year grace period means that when this income tax comes, they're not going to be able to handle it and they're going to be left stranded. However, with the RSP system, if we were to increase the allowance, this would, essentially what we're saying is the RSP is already a tax break. What we're talking about here is a tax break, and that's what the RSP is. You contribute this money, you get the tax refund for it. You're taking a system that's worked, maybe has its flaws, but it works, you're changing it slightly and actually causing more harm. You're better off not doing anything than doing what government is proposing today. That's why if you raise the allowance and allow Canadians to contribute their maximum amount to their RSPs, or increase, or even if you just increase the RSP max amount for these recent grads for 5 years, that will incentivize savings. You're not just extra spending money in their pocket, because that's the issue. Without this education, Canadians they're not saving because they spend too much, and that's why they're not paying off their debt, because we're overspending. So that means that we need to encourage them to save. Improving the RSP system would incentivize them to save and educate them on those pieces, as opposed to simply putting more money in their pocket for them to go spend on trivial things. So just reiterating our points, we believe that the RSP system should be improved because the system that side government is proposing simply shifts the burden back onto students. And as well, our current system may be flawed, but it's actually a better system than what the government's proposing, and for that reason, we're proud to oppose.
Sorry.
So what we've seen from side opposition, and I think what fundamentally kind of discredits what they've been trying to go towards, is a lot of inconsistencies in the arguments. And I'll put one out right after the second speaker. So the second speaker says, in our world where we're educating people about income tax, right, raising awareness isn't enough. But their proposed solution is Well, how many people in this room know what their RESP limit is? How many people in this room for the next 5 years will know how much our ESP limit is, right? No, none of us, right? We don't care about our RESP because we're 20 to 30-year-old adults, right? So what's their solution? Well, we're gonna have to raise awareness about it, right? So like the mechanism they discredit us for, they don't give a better mechanism. In fact, they say they will raise awareness too, right? So we think like they haven't really presented a solution then based off their own logic, right? And I think if we go down a lot of the assumptions they made about how we do this, there's a lot of ways we can get this done that side opposition seems to ignore, right? They seem to choose the most like, oh, this is the worst way to do it, and we'll say they're doing it this way, right? Not once have we come up here and told you that we're gonna be massively increasing corporate taxes to cause a shifting of the burden. And throughout my speech, I will explain to you how we'll get there and how we'll balance our burdens. But I think there are from core fundamentals I'll go through based off kind of blend argumentations they've had and why they don't necessarily work. So first is this idea that the problem is saving money. We don't believe that's the narrative that this debate is taken, right? I think we've done a clear job telling you two things. One is student debt's a problem, right? And we're giving a mechanism that better pays it off. And I'll explain it during my constructive why this mechanism better pays off student debt to improve cash flow, which is the real issue they're trying to talk about when they talk about savings. People aren't saving because the reason people aren't saving is because they don't have the cash flow to save. And we'll highlight that throughout our speech, right? And we think the second thing we talked to you about was a shift in workforce that they have not addressed, right? This idea that I need to go to university to even get a job. And while we go to a service-based economy, I need to get a more expensive degree, meaning the cost of my debt will increase to stay competitive in a workforce where automation is attending. So all these math, science, computer science degrees, which are more expensive than the currently available manufacturing-based degrees, we think those are gonna be more expensive. Student debt will become a bigger issue, and we're future-proofing ourselves and allowing us to play in that kind of market and allows the millennials to play in that market, right? And they haven't addressed that point once. Why? Because they've been fixated on this idea that saving money is the problem, right? When we've told you explicit harms, our first speaker told you how student debt cripples people's kind of spending and behavior. Our second speaker told you how student debt will become a bigger issue because of our shifting workforce, right? And we think they haven't done enough to discredit our line of thinking, which is why we'll continue with it. And we think it's a dominating narrative of this debate, right? The last thing to really look at in their idea was this corporate tax model, right? So let's say we do what they say, right? Their claims are like pretty ridiculous to the point where they're going like, oh, well, wages will drop 30% and things like that. We don't think that's a realistic approach to take, and we don't think that's the approach we're taking anyway. So let me just go into kind of my bucket right now and really explain the mechanism and why this is a better mechanism for paying off student debt and doing a lot of things. So this first idea, in our status quo system, if I graduate, I have to pay off my student debt over 10 years, let's say. I'm also paying income tax, I'm also managing my finances, I have a bunch of cash flow going. But let's say this, if you actually didn't get income tax, but we increased the amount you had to repay for your loan, guess where that money's directly going? So instead of that money going in a roundabout way to the government as government income, then they redirect it to funding for education programs, I can now pay off my debt within 5 years, right? Because I don't have to worry about that income tax, right? This opened up cash flow allows millennials to directly pay for something that has benefited them. So if I have 30,000 in student debt, guess what? My debt's gone in 5 years under this system versus their system where it's still taking me 10 years. Now, what happens when my debt's gone in 5 years? Why does this matter? Well, this does two things, right? And we think this is fundamentally where we disagree with them. So the way we make this happen and the way we make this feasible is, one, we increase the amount we require for you to pay back, right? So as a government, we're getting more money back sooner because we're charging more, right? The cash flow is increasing, right? And because they have no income tax, they're able to afford that and pay off their debt, right? So we see that that's a better system. The second idea is we think we're unleashing the millennial dollar, something that's being kept suppressed, right? We think there's a lot of purchasing power millennials have that they're not able to realize. And we think we're increasing that. So what are we doing by unleashing the millennial dollar? Well, we're actually seeing an increase in GDP, right? We're growing the pie, right? We understand that when we're moving towards, when we're shifting our workforce towards a more service-based economy, that there's a lot of things that go into that. And by increasing the GDP, increasing the dollar, we have a bigger pool to work with, we have a more competitive economy, and we have a mechanism to effectively target student debt better. So what have I really done for you with this speech, right? One is I've shown you a mechanism that lets us do this, that doesn't drop wages 30% and the whole world goes to shit, right? We don't think that's a viable option, and we've clearly accounted for it, right? So when you look at their first two speakers, their fundamental crux of argumentation was like, One, we were increasing corporate taxes, right? And like, we haven't done that, right? And you've given you a model that works. So the first speaker really hasn't told you much. The second speaker came up here and told you about how they're gonna increase savings with RESP, and their strategy to do it is raising awareness. But then they also said our strategy of raising awareness doesn't work. So I have to ask side opposition, where does raising awareness work? And when we look at that idea, do we really think we're gonna be saving and putting money into our RESP between the ages of 20 and 25, 21 to 26? Like when we look at most new grads, they're not putting money into the RESP. Let's be real here, that's just not happening, right? And we don't think that's a viable, like a route that they're proposing. So let's roadmap a bit. Let's see what we've done here for you on our side of the house and why we reframe this debate to what it's actually about. Our first speaker came up here and told you about student debt, right? It's the fastest growing debt in Canada. And it's growing at a rate because the needs of the economy require you to have higher specialized degrees, which cost more, right? We think this cash flow burden is majorly affecting students, right? So we've told you student debt's an issue. The second thing is we've proven to you that the economy is shifting, right? And they've never once engaged with the second bucket about a shifting workforce, right? And how important it is to be properly educated and incentivize people to go and get their undergraduate degree, something giving them a 5-year tax break would definitely do. So we've won on that point. So now that we've understood those two, the third thing, the thing I came here and told you, was a mechanism that gets this to work, right? And we think that the mechanisms side oppositions have proposed have been ludicrous, which is why we've thought about it. We understand in the short term there is going to be a loss, right? We're clearly going into a deficit. There's no way you don't get there. But we think in the long term, you're growing the pie, you're increasing income, and you're doing much better for society. So for all these reasons, we're proud to propose. Thank you.
Yeah, 8 minutes in the last 3 minutes.
And the first minute?
They can POI the first 5 minutes.
Okay.
It's spelled RRSP. You're right, I don't think anyone's going to contribute to the RRSP after. That would make sense at all. So side government has basically come up here and proposed a very interesting motion today. And so what I'm going to do this final 8 minutes is do a few things. One, I want to distill what this debate has actually come down to, which is just 2 arguments. Basically, like, what is the root cause problem, debt versus savings? So I want to address that. And the second thing, we want to really address the mechanism. Is this mechanism actually doing it? That's really what this debate comes down to. Then what I'll basically do is build back up government's flawed arguments for them, and then restate side opposition's very accurate arguments for us. Let's start with the 2 root issues that are going on here. Firstly, just for the sake of argument, I'm going to accept their premise that maybe student debt was the real issue. And if it is the real issue, I'm going to show them why their solution did nothing to help it, and also the fact that it's actually just not the right issue. So starting with student debt. So number one, I think our second speaker did a very eloquent job of saying, there needs to be some way that government understands that if personal taxes are reduced, a $50 billion deficit isn't something that the government can just leave as a gap. So how did we get to $50 billion? Math. And here's how the math works. 34 million Canadians in Canada, about 7 to 10% of them are between the age of 23 to 28. So I'm going to use about 7%, that's about 3 million Canadians. Let's say that they average 50 grand in average income coming out, so it's $150 billion. Somewhere between a 25 and 33% tax rate, that's between $42 and $50 billion. Bam. You can't take a $50 billion deficit and just say, okay, but 20 years from now, the pie will increase and that'll take care of the shortfall. What do you do right now? You're screwed. And that's why you basically, as a government, need to find a way to balance your budget right now. And how you do that is obviously through corporate tax rates. Now, they wanted us to ask the second question, is like, what if we don't raise corporate tax rates? Well, what if Sophie's actually Wonder Woman? She might be. But like, that's literally how ridiculous that question is. That's literally how ridiculous that question is. Like, what if the government doesn't deal with the shortfall? They're going to deal with the shortfall. And if you do any burden on the corporations, they put that burden back on the people. And so, if you thought the issue is cash flows, if you thought the issue is student debt, why does your motion not increase the net cash flows for the student? It doesn't, because you got rid of some tax and you got rid of some income, and that's a net zero. So that's why we came up in the first speech and said this is a net neutral motion that did not increase the cash flows. So if you want to believe them and say that student debt's the problem, then believe us and say that they didn't solve their root problem. And now if you want to actually believe us and say that savings is the root problem, their motion definitely does not help with increasing savings because there's no increase in cash flow. So regardless of what issue you want to say it is,
their motion didn't solve either of the issues. And that's why we came up in the first two speeches and tried to really hone in on the fact that you can believe them if you want student debt, but why would they even put the motion they put forward if they thought that student debt was the real problem? That's the only hypocrisy, as the second speaker came up and called our arguments hypocritical. That's the real hypocrisy here. Because regardless of what issue you want to take side with, you can't take issue with the fact that their motion didn't solve either problem. Okay, so let's bucket that aside and move back to this idea of an RSP. Now, we firmly believe on side opposition that savings is the root problem. And why is savings the root problem? Because we spend too much, right? So that's what's basically been happening. The 55 to 65-year-old demographic does not have enough savings to support the lifestyle they want to live when they retire. Lifestyle is basically analogous to how much you spend on your lifestyle. And that equation no longer works. And we're trying to make sure that that equation doesn't happen again with the next wave of millennials that are coming up. Okay, so take that into account. Now, if I want to actually encourage savings, you don't take a strategy that doesn't increase someone's cash flow, you encourage them to save more. Now, what side government actually doesn't understand is the RRSP is actually pretty much what their motion tried to do in the first place, except it's better. Because in RRSP, whatever you actually commit to your amount at this time, whatever you commit to your long-term savings is tax deductible. So if someone actually does commit to their savings, they get that tax relief anyway. So think about this for a second. You're a new grad. If you can actually find a way to moderate your lifestyle, live logically, and you want to put 20 grand away or 10 grand away from savings, you get this tax benefit anyway. And if she's about to come up here and tell me that, oh, but debt's the real issue, you didn't help them with the debt problem either. Yeah, I'll take your point.
Is it side opposition's view that you don't need cash flow to be able to save?
No, it's side government's view because you're not increasing their cash flow. It's side government's view that cash flow doesn't matter because your strategy did not increase their cash flow. And what this really comes down to is not only do they not understand the motion, they just don't understand how budget balancing works. And they believe that governments can take $50 billion deficits and they don't actually do any short-term mechanisms to close those gaps. And that's like an unrealistic wave of reality that side government just doesn't understand. So let's take a second and now go through each one of their arguments. I want to show you how we clashed with them and how we won each one of the arguments. So the first one is about student debt. If I haven't argued that one enough, I think I have. So student debt is not the root issue, and even if it was, their motion would solve it. Shifting workforce. Okay, that's an interesting point. So their view is that education basically needs to be promoted. We need more people being promoted to go to education. They basically believe that because of the $30K in student debt, people are choosing not to go to university. And as I think their second speaker came up and said, they're choosing instead of going and getting educated to go work at McDonald's. Quote. I don't believe that's true because Canada actually has the highest percentage of post-secondary university graduates in the world. So is our government not incentivizing people to go to post-secondary education right now? This ridiculous dramatic notion that oh my God, that student debt's the reason why we don't go to school. He was trying to put fear in the heart of you, Madam Speaker, but that's actually not what's happening in Canada right now whatsoever. And if we believe in a shifting workforce, we actually are incentivizing them to go to education, and the numbers show that that's not actually an issue in Canada. And then the third argument was the strengthened economy. They didn't strengthen the economy, again, because their motion is net neutral. Cash flows are staying exactly the way they are, and they didn't encourage long-term savings. Side government came up and talked about expanding the pie, which is basically, we can take the short-term hit because it expands the pie in the long run. What they don't actually understand is that savings is what expands that long-term pie. When people save and put money into their RRSP, it compounds. I don't want to have to explain compounding, but based on their knowledge right now, I think I need to explain that to them afterwards. The pie increases when you have long-term savings being invested over time, so that when you retire, you can live off those savings. So the motion actually is expanding the long-term pie without creating a short-term deficit. And how do you encourage savings is by raising the limit on that RRSP, which is what we tried to bring up today. Right now, 68% of income-earning Canadians are maxing out that RRSP right now. Think about that for a second. 68% of Canadians want to save, and they can't save more because of the caps that are on the RRSP right now. And if we let them save more, you get that tax benefit anyway. Because if you contribute to your RRSP, it is tax deductible. You're going to get that tax benefit anyway. So we not only are solving government's problem for them and explaining it for them, we're giving them a better solution than they proposed. Because we can actually come in and raise that limit. So the fact that there's enough people who want to save and have the infrastructure to save already in the RRSP, that's the better motion. So side opposition has done a few things today. One, we've tried to explain to government why the root problem is about savings. They do not understand that. I've given up on trying to explain it to them because I can tell by Madam Speaker's nodding that she already gets it. So side government disagrees with us. They think student debt's the problem. What we have shown you is that student debt is not the problem, but even if you want to take the premise that it is, a net neutral cash flow strategy that doesn't actually change the limit didn't do anything to solve the problem in the root case. And then the third thing we showed you is that we have the mechanism right now to encourage savings. It is the RRSP. People want to save more, and we can let them save more while giving them a tax break for increased contributions to the RRSP, which is what the motion does anyway. So we take a big step back for a second. This debate really just came down to a few things. What do you think the root cause is? Doesn't really matter when the motion the government put in place didn't solve either of the problems anyway. Okay, so now I want to reframe and basically just take a second to roadmap what's happened today. Our first speaker came up today and presented a motion as well as a reason for why she thought we were having a debate today. We disagree with the reason, we disagree with the motion, and largely everything that was said in the first 5 minutes. The second speaker basically came up and really wanted to hone on the fact that student debt is the problem. Okay, student debt is definitely an issue. It definitely is something that you got to think about. But remember that the motion that side government put in place today did not solve it. So even if they believe student debt's the problem, all we can ask them is why do you propose a motion that does nothing to help the problem that you believe in anyway? And for those two reasons, we're very proud to oppose the motion.
Sam, keep it serious.
Yeah, that's entirely. Thank you, side opposition. This debate has really come down to a few core themes, and I'm going to take these 3 minutes to try to get out as much as I can to show you why side government is clearly wrong. I think the first thing that we want to address, there's been a lot of rhetoric in this debate about is it saving the student debt, what's the real problem? Regardless of whether we on side government do believe that student debt is a massive problem, and because I have to pay a lot of student debt, I physically cannot save a bunch. And so if you reduce the amount of income tax I have to pay, and as such I can pay off my student debt in 5 years, after those 5 years, I can now save, rather than having to pay my student debt off over 10, 15, 20 years as it is today. The other thing to note, though, is while side government or side opposition did bring up an important point that savings is something that we need to address, and people need to save more for retirement. Absolutely. But realistically, reducing your income tax in 5 years after graduating is not going to massively increase the amount of retirement funds that anyone has. Just because increasing the RRSP limit, of course, will get people saving more, but you're going to get people saving more when they're 35, 40, 45, when they're thinking about saving for retirement more often. You're not going to get 23-year-olds being like, wow, this is a sound investment. Put this money away. So let's think logically. The second core thing of this debate is economic feasibility. Where does this $50 billion come from? Well, the first thing that we wanted to address is if we have $30,000 in student debt on average, it's the same 3 million people in this age bracket that benefit from this motion. That's $90 billion that's getting paid off in a time frame 5 years versus the time frame of 10 or 15 years. So that's a bunch of money that's coming into the system. The second thing that we want to address is we talked about services being cut that help to address the income gaps that people face in the first 5 years. So that's another piece of savings. And the other thing that we did talk about is we're unleashing the power of the millennial dollar. By having millennials being able to spend more on big ticket items that currently today we're not spending on, we're spending on far less than any of the previous generation. We're unlocking massive amounts of tax revenue that now come into the system that help bridge that $50 billion gap. That's the second piece. And the third piece that side opposition tried to bring up so that they could hit the point of clash, but realistically did not clash with us on, is this idea of the service-based economy. Yes, we talked about the idea that we need to be educated. Of course, we agree that Canada is a highly educated population. The other thing we didn't talk about is the reason why re-education and focusing on a services economy is so important. It's not necessarily for that 20, 21, 22-year-old. It's for that 45-year-old, that 50-year-old, who has been working a manufacturing job today, knows their job is going to disappear, and needs to go back to school to get the training that they need to compete in a service-based economy better. And our motion addresses their problem. Their motion doesn't actually do that in any way. So why do we have this debate today? Yes, it could be about student debt, which we truly believe is a problem because it is a crippling form of debt and it's important to these individuals. But even if you believe that it's savings, realistically, the motion of allowing you to contribute more to your RSP is not going to allow 23-year-olds to save more. So let's not allow their rhetoric to sway that in your mind. On side government, what we showed to you today is because of the problem of massive student debt, the fact that we have a shifting workforce that we need to address today, and the fact that this is feasible and strengthens our economy long-term by encouraging longer-term spending by these individuals, this is an important motion for us to put in place, and we're proud as government to propose.
Hey, really good job, guys. That was a great debate. Super good clash, high quality arguments. That was awesome. I'll do a few. So one on structure. I noticed after. So Andy, you did stick to Sam's 3 S's. You're saying huge drop off. After that, I think you got excited by the rebuttal a little bit.
Yeah, my bad.
So you didn't keep the story going, and then Sam brought back the story. But it was really well. And huge improvement on the connection of the story. It did land with me. So great job on that. So actual points, like why don't we talk about the clash on each one? I thought that student debt savings thing was like